Hello, everyone. This is Tanvir again on another episode of Disruptors on the Block, a series of podcasts I do covering multiple industries in the real world asset tokenization space. Really excited to cover green energy and solar today. It's an area that is of huge interest to me, and I'm sure it will be to many of the listeners. We have very special guests today who's done some incredible things over the past few years in the tokenization of solar or green energy. We have Sol Wainwright joining us from Cape Town. He was an executive. He played an executive role for many years, starting as CFO and then CEO. And we're going to learn about their story, some of the great successes that they had, what else we can expect in the industry, some advice he has after having spent several years in the space, what advice he has for others or investors or whatnot, right? So, Saul, thank you for joining us. I know it's fairly late, there in Cape Town, in beautiful Cape Town, and I'm really looking forward to spending a good 45 minutes to an hour with you.
Great. Thank you so much, Tanvi.
A little bit of Saul's background. He went to school right here where I am in Silicon Valley at the UC Berkeley, also an MPhil at the University in Cape Town, several stints as a chief financial officer, both in a advisory role, consultant role, as well as being a CFO. And then he continued doing that in the CFO role, like I mentioned, at Sun Exchange, which became a very prominent, very visible player. I would say a half a dozen. When I did a complete research, I came up with barely 5 or 6 names where they have done meaningful impact and they had success, and Sun Exchange is one of them. So he went on to be the CEO role. About March, say about 3 months ago, they were acquired by, I think, a private equity company so that they could scale and grow the business further. We'll hopefully talk about that as well. So, Saul, to set the stage for our conversation, once again, thank you for joining us. Could you share, the story, right? Like, how did this company come into being? What was that impetus that drove the formation of Sun Exchange? And then later on, we can talk a little bit about the success stories, etc. But just want to understand a little bit of history of how that company came together.
Sure. So, Sun Exchange was founded by a gentleman by the name of Abraham Cambridge, he's from the UK, and he moved to South Africa in about 2014, 2015, and noticed that when he arrived in South Africa that there was a real lack of rooftop solar in the country. And he was very curious about why this was so in a country that was struggling with energy access, reliable and cheap energy, and was it kind of sparked an exploration for him. And in that exploration, he realized that one of the main factors missing was capital for smaller businesses, nonprofits, and the like, who could not get access to regular capital from banks. And he was also a big fan of crypto, and at that time was involved in crypto, and thought that the marriage between distributed energy and distributed money was a perfect marriage. And this led the exploration into how to bring those two together. And his initial idea was to go out and fund a solar project on a school. The first school that he did was Stellenbosch Waldorf School, just up the road from here, about 45 minutes outside of Cape Town. And he used a platform and a global approach utilizing crypto, and specifically at that time, Bitcoin. At this time, Bitcoin was probably one of the, still as it is today, one of the bigger and most known cryptos. And so this sparked a whole evolution of a company that when he successfully was able to raise money for that one school, it quickly realized that there was an opportunity to do this again and again. And out of that, Sun Exchange was born. A platform was created that enabled people all over the world to sign up, register, and contribute towards owning a piece of the solar power plant. And the way the company did that was to, if you take a solar panel, it has a bunch of solar cells in it. Each cell produces power on its own. So you can remove a cell from a solar panel, plug a couple wires into it, put it in the sun, and out comes power. And so the idea was that we would take solar panels, each solar panel, let's say, at this time, I don't remember how many cells there were. Let's, for argument's sake, say there were 100. solar cells in a panel. Each panel cost, again, for argument's sake, $1,000. So each cell would sell for $10. And anyone in the world could come and buy a solar cell. And once you had 100 people purchasing solar cells, you had one solar panel. And 100 people would then earn the energy from the output of that solar panel. And that energy output would be billed to the energy consumer, who would pay Sun Exchange in national currency, in South African rands in this case. And we would then convert that South African rand into Bitcoin and deposit your share of earnings into your Bitcoin wallet. And you could choose to reinvest that Bitcoin or withdraw it. And that was kind of the genesis of Sun Exchange. And from there, we went off and solar powered many other institutions.
Beautiful. It's such it is a fascinating, story, because I think here I can see the real power of tokenization and fractionalization come into play, because you in layman's terms, in the real estate world, what you're actually breaking down is, instead of selling an entire house, you're selling it by the brick. Or you can, another way to look at it is, maybe you're selling it by the square foot, right? Or maybe it could even be sold by the square inch, but let's say by the square foot. So you actually take, what could be a power plant for a church or a office building or nonprofit, a community center, right? That itself is a mini power plant, right? I mean, even though you can call it a power plant, but that solar installation, and it may have 20, 30, 40 panels, right? And you can break down the panel into 100 fractions, right? Was the
Correct.
100 just an example, or was that the real, you could break it
No,
down
that's
into
an
100?
example. It
That's an example.
changes how many cells they are, changes depending on the size of the panel. And over the last 10 years, panels have gotten bigger and the amount of solar cells has gotten larger. But I think an important part of that is that you didn't pay just for the panel. You'd look at how much it costs to put the whole system together: inverters, cabling, racking, design, all of that. And then you would say, this total solar power plant has 100 panels and 10,000 cells, but it costs $1 million to build. And so you would divide the million by the 10,000. So you were paying extra in that sense. It wasn't the true cost of a solar panel or cell. It was the cost of the total system divided by that amount of solar cells. And I think the really important thing that Sun Exchange, was trying to do at this point was, again, we try to make the argument that this therefore wasn't a security, and because each one of these solar cells actually produced power. In theory, you could take a solar cell and send it to someone. If they said, actually, I don't want to be involved in this project anymore, I want my solar cell back. Now, this never happened, but in theory, you could send them a solar cell and say, okay, well, you paid $10 for the solar cell. Here's your solar cell. And this was an important part of how we went to market. And I think we can get into that further around kind of the innovations of the innovations that Sun Exchange tried to implement around and get around certain or regulatory frameworks that 10 years ago really didn't speak to the evolution of this new technology in the marketplace.
I want to clarify if I understood you correctly, Saul. So when you all were operating this, you all were still considered a security by the regulatory bodies in the government, or you were not, because you're actually generating the power?
Well, that became one of the contentious and challenging issues for Sun Exchange, and persisted for many years as we tried to unpack that. Every region in the world has slightly different definitions of a security, and the US has a particular definition, and it's I can't recall the details of it right now, but essentially, America had one view. Each European nation state has a slightly different view, and South Africa had a different view. In South Africa, we were not considered a security.
It wasn't considered a security.
In South Africa, it was not considered a security. But America takes a very global view of its regulatory powers, and it said, look, if an American invests in your project, they're covered by American law. And if you market this product in America, you're subject to American law, even though you may be outside of America, or the asset itself might be outside of America. And so that meant that we had to engage with lawyers in the US, and we went through multiple rounds of legal conversations. And I don't even want to tell you how much we spent on legal fees, but let's just say a lot of lawyers made a lot of money off Sun Exchange. And the general definition, general consensus amongst American lawyers was that this is going to be considered a security. Even though your solar cell produces power on its own, and the view was that the power plant still required management, right? And if management is required, then your return is dependent on my behavior, not on the asset's behavior. And therefore, it fell into a regulatory framework. It was at that time that we also explored other ways of approaching it and truly tokenizing every aspect of it. So people weren't necessarily buying solar cells, they were buying a tokenized version of a solar cell. And to try and get around that, we looked at incorporating in the Virgin Islands and other regions of the world that had better supporting framework. But the truth is, we could never find something that brought comfort to our main investors and felt that they could back it with more money and take on more risk. Whether they were right or wrong, we can have that debate.
Yeah, I wish it wasn't that complex, right? I think the good news is, and I'm hoping there'll be more examples. Saul, you may have read the news. Dubai recently made a big announcement saying that they will, when it comes to tokenization of real estate, they will not consider it a security. And I'm hoping other jurisdictions would also have a similar thinking, right?
Right, but I think that the challenge is, and is one of your biggest markets in the world is the US, and you want
No
access
doubt.
to that money, right? And you can't then market your product in the US. Dubai can do whatever it wants. It's great if I'm a Dubai citizen or I live in a country where they don't apply the same regulatory logic. That's great. I maybe as a South African can invest in a Dubai entity that can advertise and market itself in South Africa. But the Americans don't view it that way. um, and this is a quirk. This is another quirk of kind of how the global world of investing works, and the way it views Africa in particular is, they don't, at the time they didn't trust maybe the contractual framework of South Africa, so equity investors wanted to put their money in through a Delaware corp. So now there are two kind, and I just want to be clear, I'm talking about two different kinds of investors here. One are the people that invested and owned solar power plants, and the other one are investors that owned equity in Sun Exchange as a tech platform. And that group wanted their funds put through a US holding company based in Delaware. Even though all our operations were in South Africa, we couldn't attract equity funding into South Africa as easily as we could into America. This is a common issue for businesses in Africa and other parts of the world, where you're kind of forced into the American or European jurisdiction, which has regulations that may actually hamper your business model in the actual market that you function in. That shifted a lot in the last, 5+ years, I would say. And I believe, given the current geopolitical moment, that may accelerate even further. But at the time in 2015, 2016, that wasn't the way that the marketplace was viewed. So we were kind of shoehorned into that issue in the US. So it limited our ability to go to market and acquire the kinds of funding that we wanted for solar panels in the US.
Now, I also want to clarify this, Saul. You all chose South Africa as your primary market, mainly because of you all being there, or you all found some distinctive advantage. Obviously, there's the irradiation levels, more sunshine available compared to some of the European countries, right? Oh,
Yeah. So I mean,
so
that
what was because you all had roots in South Africa, you all chose South Africa, or there was other benefit?
well, I think that, of course, it was there was an element of this is where we are, so this is,
Yes.
but when you look at it on the face of it, and South Africa, I don't know if this stat still is true, but I would assume it's still pretty close to accurate, though we've built out huge amounts of renewable energy in South Africa. But at the time, South Africa produced more CO2 per person than any other country in the world. So it was an extremely, high rate of carbon emissions in South Africa because we have dirty old coal power plants. I think 80% of our power at the time was coming from coal and not necessarily the highest grade coal. And so, if you as an individual are thinking about, well, and here we're talking about not, you're making decisions not purely on a financial basis, but you're making decisions based on, I want to reduce my carbon footprint. I'm sitting in Germany, London, Norway, and I want to reduce my carbon footprint, and I've got $100. I could put $100 into putting, or it's a small, the number doesn't really make sense. It doesn't really matter, but I could invest this money into putting solar panels on my roof because then it'll reduce my carbon emissions in Germany. But Germany's grid is relatively clean compared to South Africa's. So is the UK, so is Norway, so is France. So for that $100, maybe I'm offsetting 50 kilograms of CO2. Whereas $100 in South Africa would offset 150, 200 kilograms. And again, I'm just, I'm using these numbers to be illustrative. I don't have, these are not accurate, except to say that South Africa was a high emitter. So there was a distinct advantage from an allocation of resource. And if you frame it into a world that's trying to reduce its carbon emissions, hey guys, put $100 into South Africa, build a solar power plant, way less carbon. Carbon's global, doesn't matter where in the world, but you're going to offset way more carbon. And hey, look, you're also going to help somebody, a school, a retirement village get cheaper, more reliable electricity. So it was a sweet spot. And then, of course, South Africa had increase in energy availability over the course of the time that we were in operation. So there were multiple reasons why it made more sense. Was it the best financial returns? Not necessarily. There may have been better financial returns for that $100 somewhere else in the world, maybe equities, but that kind of social impact, environmental impact was definitely a driver in building out the business here.
This is very interesting. I didn't realize that emission levels was so high in South Africa. Obviously, one of the biggest, probably the crown jewel in all of the African continent, right? May not be as large as Nigeria because of the Egypt with the bigger population, but definitely a very vibrant
Yeah, on a per capita
country.
basis, right? We're talking on a
And
per
yes, and a
capita
part of
basis.
BRICS, so it's got its standing in the world. Now, I want to switch over a little bit to the investors. Now, were your investors primarily from the country of South Africa, or they were from all over the world or all across Africa? And how was Sun Exchange attracting them? Right? How were you able to find your investors? Right? And you all started 2017, 18, if I'm not mistaken. Obviously, there was a lot of hype. There was a lot of bloated expectations, I think. So in a way, it was good and bad, but still very early days. You'll pioneered this. We'll talk a little more about that journey, but from the investor view, where were your investors from? How did you all find them? And what kind of returns were they typically receiving?
Yeah, so I think about 50 to 60% of our investors were South African. But in terms of dollars spend, I would say 75 to 80% came from outside of South Africa. So by about 2024, an exchange had about 40,000 individuals in 180 countries that were spending funds putting funds into solar projects, and the majority of them being South Africa, but the majority of the spend being US, EU, and other parts of the world. We've spent very, very little on marketing. We really focused on earned PR. So we really doubled down on a PR approach and reached out and earned that kind of conversation and got into a lot, BBC, lots of big publications, crypto blog, podcasts and stuff talked about us. So it was really through that mechanism of kind of guerrilla marketing in a way, and just getting out into the marketplace and finding people and engaging with them on that front. So I think in the first 5 years, we probably spent a couple $100,000 on marketing. Yeah, it was a sweet spot, right? Everybody wanted to. It was the right time. to be talking about what we were talking about.
This is actually great. I was thinking maybe your cost per acquisition may be very high. So I guess there was a lot of press. This is truly impressive, Saul, to have such adoption. You mentioned 180 countries, and even the 40,000 number is a respectable number, right? Almost sounds like you'll achieved a product market fit, right? And we'll talk about some of the challenges you'll experience in the scaling and all of that. From what I gathered, investors could expect a low double digit kind of well, actually, maybe if I have to give a range, anywhere from 6 to 12%.
Yeah, I would
Is
say,
that right?
yeah,
And
yeah,
why did it
yeah.
vary so much, right?
Correct. Now, this is, an IRR return, right? Which kind of equates, so 10%, maybe it equates on an annual basis somewhere around 8 or 9%. Um, and uh, it was typically denominated in South African rands, but you were getting paid out in crypto. What we also found a lot was that people would actually buy in in dollars or euros, get paid out in Bitcoin. And so for a lot of people, it was their first, like we probably helped bring thousands of people into the crypto space because it became this interesting way for them to get into crypto. And it also meant that they part of their upside was the upside exposure to the appreciation of crypto, though it's gone through its multiple ups and downs over time,
And
long
that
term.
was solely Bitcoin, right? So when you say crypto, the payments were
Yeah,
only
yeah, it
Bitcoin,
was
not
solely
Ethereum or
solely
anything else.
Bitcoin,
Now,
absolutely.
if you look back as as a business leader, was that a good decision? Did that help the company that it was payouts were in crypto, or in hindsight, it felt maybe it would have been better off if you just done it in that currency, right, in the local currency?
I think if we'd done it in only a national currency, I think the regulatory environment would have been more restrictive in the outset. And I say that because you would have gone and said, okay, I'm gonna accept dollars and I'll pay out in dollars. But then you've got to have a certain banking regime and banking relationships and whatnot. And then with crypto, anyone anywhere in the world could participate. And I could accept your Bitcoin irrespective of where you were based in the world. Getting paid in national currency added certain complications to that, especially in the payout. The receiving was easy enough. You could sign up for a credit card service and anybody could click pay by credit card, and that part of the payment worked. But if I wanted to send you back your $5 of earnings, that was much harder in national currency. Only time
So in a
we've
way,
ever.
doing crypto was benefiting to you guys, right?
Exactly. I would say it was definitely beneficial. What would have been nicer probably would have been to accept a range of crypto, not just Bitcoin. But when we started, it was, again, early days. There weren't that many other cryptos out there. Ethereum was, I think, around by, I don't know when, I forget now when Ethereum just turned 10. So it was 2015, right? So when we started, 2015 was the first project we did, but we really got rolling in 2017. ETH was still very new on the space, and therefore the multiplicity of cryptos was minimal at that time.
This is great. I want to go back to the 40,000 customers. The I guess a lot of your success came from US, right? Is that correct? Yeah, from the Americas. What was the ticket size, right? Were they investing $100, less than 100, or was there an average ticket size for the investment?
The minimum ticket size was at the time probably around $5 to $8. So it was very small. Now, in retrospect, I probably would have increased that minimum spend, though our cost of acquisition was low. Our ongoing maintenance of a customer is high because you bring them in, but now you've got a relationship for 20 years. These are 20-year engagements and you're dealing with that customer for 20 years. So really if the lifetime value was only $5 of that customer, you were very likely never to make money on that individual customer just through the ongoing administrative costs. So that was probably one of the weaknesses that that we had. I would, if I were to do it again, I would probably set the bar closer to $100 minimum.
That was, and I was thinking 100 too. While when you were explaining this, right? Minimum 100. It'd be nice if people would do $1,000, right? Of course, in some countries, 1,000 can be steep. But in Europe or the Americas, U.S., Canada, Australia, 1,000
Yeah.
is steep, right?
Yeah,
Doable.
yeah. So, we got a lot of repeat investors, right? So, what we saw often was somebody would do one project, they put in $5, they'd wait to see that we weren't, messing them around. Once they started seeing some revenue flow, they're like, okay. And then they were likely to spend $100 or $200 the next time round. But that was, of course, not everyone. That's a certain subset of your customer base.
But so we spoke a little bit about on the investor side. Now, moving to the consumers, was there a certain segment where you'll end up installing more, as in, places of worship, community centers, or commercial offices for small, medium businesses, or was it very distributed right across all, and homes potentially too? You did homes too, I'm assuming, right?
No, we never did
No,
residential.
you did residential.
And residential solar, as many people can attest in the marketplace of solar, is a very, very hard area to work, especially if you do a power purchase agreement. It's one thing to sell somebody a solar system, put it on their roof, and say, all right, it's yours, cheerio. But it's another thing if you want people sell their houses. So we focused on businesses, and our real specialty was schools, and we were able to really do very well amongst schools. And we were first and foremost, Sun Exchange was a values based company, right? We wanted to have positive impact. We wanted to reduce carbon emissions. We wanted to give school, businesses cheaper power and reliable power. And we wanted to target people that couldn't get the traditional access to capital, which meant that we had a pretty open marketplace. All these that are very uncompetitive in terms of other developers coming and trying to sell to those institutions. And because we were crowdfunding, the level of due diligence and need to go through investment committees and stuff like that was reduced. So you could kind of present, here's a school, here's its finances, it's been around for 100 years, they're buying electricity, you're going to have all this positive impact. And that really appealed to people. And so we really, I think we probably solar powered, I want to guess around 40 to 50 schools, and then a lot of CNI, retirement villages. So businesses that were smaller but really needed it. And we, out of the 120 power plants we built, I think we had 3 default in any meaningful way. So they were actually very reliable customers, but you just couldn't see that on their balance sheet.
But this is fascinating and very nice to see that you all saw this as an impact play, and you'll also position this right to the world that, hey, there is a strong impact. So that was part of your messaging and marketing, I'm assuming, right? Very
Yeah,
interesting to hear half of it came from schools. To drill down further, were these public or what we call government schools, or were they private or a mixture of both?
it was a mixture.
It
They
was a
were
mixture of both.
definitely on, in South Africa, and I think, the US has the same thing. You have a range of public schools, wealthier public schools and poorer public schools. So we definitely targeted the wealthier public schools, though we did land up doing a bunch of other projects. And we worked with an organization out of the US that provided certain kinds of donor funding that helped offset some of the risk around poorer schools, and we put together a bunch of donor type products. But I did want to say the other part of what we were really, in terms of this value play, and I think it's really important because so much of our world is consumed by just the idea of getting rich and making money where off whatever we do, and damn be the impact. And here we didn't just look at the impact for the school. We saw the impact for the school, but we also saw an opportunity for individuals around the world to allocate their resource directly into something that they felt attached to and believed it would have impact. The real vision, and this is what really drew me to Sun Exchange. I'd been based in Silicon Valley for a long time, and the whole social capital and social impact markets and that whole thing really appealed to me. But I struggled to find that kind of opportunity in Silicon Valley and that was meaningful for me. And here was this business that was saying to everyone all over the world, hey, you care about solar, you care about carbon, you care about helping schools, communities. Here's a way for you to put your money into a real asset on the ground that's actually doing that. Don't need to go put it in an indexed fund that claims to be green, that's managed by Schwab or Merrill Lynch or whoever it is. And who knows whether that's actually been allocated into something meaningful. So that was, it was really, we really designed our business to benefit all stakeholders. The people that built the solar, the people that consumed the energy, and the people that funded it. And I think that that was a beautiful thing about what Sun Exchange did. And it really proved that there was a desire for that in the marketplace. And the 40,000 people from 180 countries kind of only reinforced that in our mind.
No, no, love the story. And I believe so these institutions who installed the plant, the solar plant, were they experiencing a 20 to 40% reduction in, compared to the utility rates? Was it significantly lower?
Yes, we typically try to target somewhere around 30%.
30%. Yeah,
But
that
if
is huge.
anyone listening to this is knowledgeable about solar, of course, those sorts of things are based on forecasts of production and consumption. So if those things, that savings can go up or down. But that was what we tried to do, and we also locked in the escalation rate. So we fixed it to inflation plus a couple percent, whereas electricity, especially in South Africa, and I think in other parts of the world, from the grid supplied electricity is typically escalated at rates far higher than inflation.
And now the average man, the cost for power for the average business, or let's talk about business. Is South Africa subsidizing its power, or they people are paying, like they feel that they feel the pinch on their electricity bills
I would
typically?
say that, there was a time when South Africa had some of the cheapest power in the world, but due to corruption and gross mismanagement of our public utility, that has quickly changed. And I would say it's a major cost to businesses in South Africa. So it also had a positive net effect on the bottom line for many businesses, and especially again schools, retirement villages, anybody with a fixed kind of budget, that it had very serious positive impact.
Now, just a comment here, Saul. You lived in the Bay Area for many years, went to school here. We have PG&E here, and we pay among the highest rates in the U.S. with PG&E. One of the reasons also is PG&E had those big wildfires, and they are recovering. They're recouping, right? Everything gets passed on to the consumers. Last time I saw my bill, I think at peak I was paying almost half a dollar, right, 49.50 per kilowatt hour, which is very steep. I have a friend who lives in Santa Clara, where the city of Santa Clara is involved in the utility there, and their rates are less than half, right? So you see how much PG&E is making, right? And they have their reasons, but this is great what you're doing, right? There's a clear benefit to the consumer of that power that they get. Does South Africa experience power cuts that like happens in underdeveloped and developing countries? I'm not calling you guys either, but or at least the grid would, y'all were like self-sustaining when it comes to power.
Currently, for the most part, we're not experiencing any kind of power cuts. It's been about 18 months since we last had major power cuts, but pretty consistently from about 2017 through about, early 2024, we had major power cuts. At one point, we were without power on a rotating basis about 6 to 8 hours a day. So, yes, absolutely. Distributed behind the meter solutions were very appealing. Or a quirk of solar, if you don't have a reference current coming in, the inverter doesn't know how much power to produce, and basically your solar system has to switch off. So even if you lose power, your solar system has to switch off unless it's in some kind of islanded situation. And the way you can do that is using a generator or batteries. And with the massive reduction in the cost of batteries over probably the last, 4 or 5 years, that is where things really changed. And that both presented an opportunity to Sun Exchange, but it also presented a big challenge to us because suddenly, a customer solar power plant that would normally cost $100,000 to build, if you wanted to really give them a system that worked, they needed to put batteries in, and batteries are typically, even at a cost reduction, were 2 to 3x the cost of the solar. So a plant went from 100 to $400,000. Now you're going to your community asking them for a lot more money, and that slowed down our ability to crowdfund. And this was the kind of the inflection point that Sun Exchange hit, where we realized, we had a huge pipeline of projects, but we couldn't, it was taking us longer and longer to fund project. The only way we could get out of that was to, of course, increase the amount of members coming to our platform. But the only way you could increase the amount of members coming to your platform was to be able to, now you want to double down on marketing. But suddenly you can't market into some of the biggest markets because of the regulatory stuff. So suddenly you couldn't go into America and, push hard and spend all this money and drive customers to you. So you suddenly, everything kind of became misaligned. And that created a massive, massive challenge for Sun Exchange. More so than the crypto element at this point. Earlier on, the crypto was challenging, but that had kind of already, by the early teens, was already kind of finding its way out in America. There was clearer ways, of operating crypto and bank, but the issue of this being a security meant that you had to go through this whole next layer of costs. And it just, yeah, that's when we started facing real challenges as a business.
So, what will be the best solution moving forward? Like, what is the ideal solution to this problem?
Well, I mean, I think the ideal solution, of course, would be to, in my view, you can't necessarily be global in your funding source,
Sorry, could you
right?
repeat that? I lost
You
you there.
can't be global in your crowdfunding source. So trying to crowdfund from, A to Z of the countries in the world, even though crypto moves across borders and is not constrained by Swift and other systems, that that landed up not necessarily being the best approach for Sun Exchange. What would probably work is maybe you set up a fund in the US and you set up a fund in Europe and maybe one other, and you fund into those, and those funds put the money down into South Africa or other regions to manage money. That breaks your direct asset ownership model to a great degree. Now you're more into you're owning some shares in a fund, and so the model as it stood in terms of direct asset ownership through a crypto crowdfunding platform where everybody from anywhere could do it, it doesn't really work in a world that does have states that have power to regulate what goes on within their economy and in their jurisdiction. There is still, in my view, a massive need for funds that can be directed at these kinds of smaller businesses and institutions. As we know in America, 70-80% of the economy is small businesses, right? Like that is the backbone, and the same is true in Africa. But what you find is that if you approach a fund to solar power a school that's $300,000, it's not really viable for that fund to go through the due diligence because of cost of capital. It's the same thing that's why we have angel investors in the world first. They're coming first before VCs, right? Because an angel investor can make the decision, doesn't have to sit with his IC, bring in the 6 lawyers and spend $100,000 figuring out if this is a good investment. And it's the same thing that distributed behind the meter small scale solar faces in Africa. The cost of capital through traditional means just is It doesn't make sense. So there's in my view, a need for a model that doesn't have that kind of hurdle in front of it, has a clear mandate that says solar power all schools and in South Africa. And we'll take an assumption that 20% of them will default, and we build a financial model based on those assumptions and go to town. That model doesn't exist anywhere that I've seen. I have not seen a funder that plays in the market like that. But that certainly would be a game changer. That doesn't mean that it can't be crypto, that you can't still play that aspect of it. In fact, you can still embed that into your product offering. But the way in which you go about collecting those funds is really where the challenge existed. And I think that model would have to look different.
I have one other question on the for the consumers of the power, and then we'll switch gears. And I'm hoping. Do you have a hard stop in 7 minutes, or you have a little more time? I have a few minutes left. I appreciate the flexibility. You said I was pleasantly surprised to hear that you'll didn't have too much of difficulty in attracting the investors, and the cost of acquisition also wasn't a big concern. I'm assuming, was it also onboarding a bunch of schools, because it is someone has to go approach the schools and all of that. Was there any difficulty there, or that was also relatively smooth and these institutions were eager to work with you all, right?
They
And
were
was the
eager to
cost
work with us.
management?
No, we had many, and I mean, once you kind of prove it a couple times, we had a good, strong brand name in South Africa. So acquiring those projects wasn't a challenge. In fact, we had more than we could service because of the constraints around the capital. Now, I do want to point out that if we were to go being to a more regulated environment, of course, that cost of acquisition would go up, right? Because of your KYC and KML and all of that would or AML would increase, right? I don't think it would become out of hand, but you would definitely, and that goes back to our what we spoke about earlier in terms of the minimum investment would have to go up, which would mean certain market segment would be excluded potentially, but you can have that be different in different markets. In South Africa, you could make that much lower because your cost of acquisition is maybe lower because the regulatory environment is different. But yeah, that would have to look a little different.
Now, I want to segue into like taking lessons learned and seeing how this could be applied to on a larger scale, right? So I have a few questions there. Before I go there, see, for me personally, also, right? I mean, if I look back at my own life, growing up in the city of Bangalore, which is considered India's tech capital, but typical middle class family, we would see a lot of what we call load shedding. That was a term that was used where for a
The same
minimum
term they
on
use
most
here.
nights, yes, load shedding. Most nights, 2 hours of no power. So I did my high schooling. A lot of my schooling, high schooling, probably got better when I went to engineering, but at least high school, I remember candles. Later on, we got one of those rechargeable lamps, right, that you could quickly charge it, and you have that. But a lot of candles, even kerosene lamps, just it was a struggle, right? And I see it in other parts of the world too. I have a few people who do gigs for me in the Indian subcontinent, like think Pakistan. They showed me their energy bills, and I was shocked. Pakistan has a big problem and humongous energy bills, crippling middle class families or low income families, right? Now, and I've seen that, I was in pilgrimage in Iraq, and again, it was common for power cuts there as well, right? Where I'm going with this, Saul, is imagine an underdeveloped country or developing country where they want to build a large power plant, right? 100 meg or half a gig, right? Because now when you get to gig, 1 gig, it's $1 billion plus project, right? But let's talk even 50, 100 meg that can power a entire community. Can your model, from all the lessons learned, can your model be scaled where now you can maybe have $1,000 minimum, and you're raising a large amount of money? Because and we also know that the crypto industry also, and I know crypto is not tokenization. Cryptos is a subset of blockchain, right? But there is confidence now, right? Blockchain is well over 100K. There's a lot of more belief in crypto. There's a lot more belief in blockchain. Is that possible? And are we going to see bigger projects come up, right? Where entire power plants would be funded with tokenization and fractional ownership?
I think It would be a big ask based on, I think it would be tough to raise that much from lots of individuals. I think you'd probably need probably even a bigger minimum. I think what makes a difference in that market is, what currently happens is, on those big projects, typically a bunch of funders come together, put in equity, build the power plant. Power plant runs for a couple years, and then they go and acquire debt and extract some of their equity through a debt.
So they don't start. This is a very valid point. So Saul, what you're saying is they don't start from debt. I was thinking for a bigger power plant, if this what we call like this peer-to-peer investing, right? If they can come up with 20% or 30%, and then the remaining can come from lower cost debt. Is that a possibility, or that's not the norm? What are your
My
thoughts there?
my my experience and knowledge, and I could be, I can definitely be corrected on this, and I haven't done a huge amount of work in large scale solar, but my understanding is because the risk for a debt guy is big when there's nothing in the ground, right? So you typically bring in equity partners. They fund it all out of equity cash. Once that power plant is up and running and there's revenue, you're going to get much, much cheaper debt at that point, right? And yeah, you might leverage it up to, 30%, 40% of your plant. That frees you up. And for guys that play in this game, now they got the 30, 40, and they go and put that equity into the next plant and the next plant. I think there's definitely room for cheaper equity capital through crypto and tokenization and whatnot to enter into that and say, okay, you got 20% debt, we'll do 20%, crypto funded, and we'll take a slightly lower return than the debt guys, or we'll match the debt guys or something like that, right? I definitely think that there's play there, an opportunity there for, and I think what's really was, and this is why Sun Exchange got so much earned media, is that a lot of what goes on in the crypto space and in tokenization is speculation. It's speculative investment. Oh, it's going to go up, so I'm going to buy now, buy low, sell high kind of idea. And there's and I'm not saying this is, but when we were doing it, that was pretty much true. There was no other way to make money off your Bitcoin but hope that the value of Bitcoin went up. Here was a way for you to make your Bitcoin create more money for yourself. And I think that that opportunity still exists. You can take that Bitcoin, you could try and, wrap it, do a wrapped Bitcoin and turn it into a debt instrument, or you could put it into this solar plant and earn that back over time. Electricity is pretty, reliable. It's a quite reliable investment, and it's a real asset on the ground. You're not buying equity in some company that may or may not succeed. If I build a solar power plant that's 100 megs and I got, a big mining company buying that power for 20 years and the rates are all predetermined, you're pretty locked in on your return. And I think that there's an opportunity for funds to look at that. And I think especially in markets like South Africa where and other emerging markets where debt can be quite expensive, especially if you're trying to get offshore debt. Onshore debt can be hard to get because the banking world in most of Africa is not very advanced in terms of its ability to raise bonds, and its kind of liquidity levels are just not the same as what you have in Europe, America, and probably, parts of Asia and the Middle East. So, there's a definitely a gap in the market that's still looking for an instrument to come in and offer that. And yes, I do believe there's something there for crypto.
Another comment, right? Like, sometimes you have the diaspora who wants to give back, or obviously they want a return, but you have a diaspora, right? In South Africa, think of the millions of South Africans who are across the world, right? Probably quite a few in London and maybe in the Americas, whatnot, that they become some of the bigger investors. They are, helping rebuild or build new infrastructure in their country, and they get a return. I love what you all did with the Bitcoin component, and I think in the prep call you and me spoke, right, that hey, even without, I mean, if you add the growth of Bitcoin, then that return becomes even more attractive, right, significantly. I'm a believer in Bitcoin, right, not so much as an investor, but it's transformative power and all of that, right. And a lot of experts say that it's going to 10x or whatever. Again, we're not offering any investment advice or anything like that. This is what I'm hearing, but so I guess I think that was very cool what you all did. What are your thoughts, if you're at liberty to share? Um, and if you kept your eyes on some of your other, other players in the space, right? I won't call them competitors because they're probably not in South Africa, but like Power Ledger or WePower or Trime came to my mind. Were you very dramatically different from the way they approach things, and how do you compare with them? How did you all compare with them?
Yeah, I mean, Power Ledger, and I was an early owner of their token when they first came out. Definitely a different model there. I think, that if I remember correctly, they were really, you know, tokenizing the energy in a way, right? And using that versus we were using Bitcoin to fund the asset. So I think that there was two different areas. Trine, I think, was a if I recall correctly, was a pure debt instrument. So I think they raised notes, and then once they raised a note, they invested, and that note had a certain return on it, if I remember correctly. It's been a while since these things get a little bit muddled in my head, but I believe we were, if not the only one of maybe two in the world that were doing this and taking the particular approach that we were taking.
Are you able to share what were some of the underlying technologies? Was there a certain blockchain that you all used? Was it Ethereum or Solana? And your thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, we didn't. We because the way that we actually designed it at the beginning, and because we didn't build out a full tokenized platform, we really just had a Bitcoin node, and that Bitcoin node was just used to do the exchanges and the back and forth. So it was a fairly simple approach to using the blockchain.
So you all
I
didn't have
think
to
now we might go
have
differently.
you all didn't have to have a tokenization platform provider to no, right? And I don't think you all called it tokenization though, right? It's fractionalization, not so much as tokenization, right? Yeah,
Exactly. It
gotcha.
was much more about fractional ownership. Like I said earlier, distributed energy, distributed money, bringing these two fractionalized technologies together and taking advantage of the fact that you could fractionalize. And that's really, and in that way, it wasn't hugely innovative. Fractionalization is just, in my view, another way of saying, shares in a company is a fractionalization of a company, right? But it was the fact that you could marry these two technologies together and keep the price point low enough that anybody could come in and participate. And that it was really the marriage of existing technologies rather than innovating a technology or innovating a platform or in that way. So it wasn't hugely innovative from that point of view.
I'll probably have a couple more questions and then we'll be done. Can you share what was the 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 primary reason to sell the business to a private equity firm? Was it because it was to scale, or probably you all ran into significant headwinds and felt, hey, we'll need a lot more capital? So just want to understand the happened.
Yeah, I would say there were two major reasons that we had to look at offloading the company. One was we couldn't match the demand in the market fast enough.
A
So
demand
we
for, like, from the end users,
solar,
like the
yeah,
okay,
for
okay.
for all
So a
for the
lot more
energy
schools, a lot
consumer,
more
right?
churches wanting it, right? A lot more retirement.
My business development team was going out there, closing deals, coming back, and it was taking us 6 months to fund that project. And the energy consumers like, I'm going to go somewhere else. And the market got competitive, right? So there were other people coming into the market. They maybe weren't able to offer the cheapest, better or whatever, but they could deliver faster. And the only way I could increase my funding pipeline from an investor point of view was to market more. But the only way I could market more was to bring in more capital because that's forward investment, right? But I couldn't bring in more capital because I couldn't clear, and this was the next thing, the regulatory hurdle of becoming a security, which meant that the cost, all of your existing costs, your KYC, your pricing model, all of that had to be revisited. And our investors weren't willing at that time to
And these
do.
and this is investors in the startup
Yes,
as VCs, or not the fund as such, or both, right?
correct. No, no, no. The VCs,
The VCs,
right?
yeah. Because if you had got the funding, then you all could have invested in more marketing, probably driven up that tiny ticket
Yeah.
size to 100 or 200,
Yeah,
right?
if I could have
Yeah, that
secured
would have
maybe
been
another
perfect.
five or 10
So I
million,
guess regulation was the biggest bottleneck. That's the lesson.
that became the bottleneck, right? And we were squeezed on both sides. One, I couldn't get access to the American market without spending a whole bunch more money that I didn't have. Revenues, therefore, were tanking because I couldn't fund projects fast enough, therefore, meeting your salaries and everything. So you're like, okay, I'm on a downward spiral here. And then we were hit with the double whammy that South Africa got what's called gray listed. So there was a bunch of questions about what was going on in South Africa, and we were put on this kind of watch list. And then the only way to get off that watch list was for the South African regulatory environment to tighten up. And they changed a bunch of rules around that impacted our corporate structure. They would have forced us to go and get new licenses to operate with our crypto, to go and re KYC all of our customers. So suddenly we had this huge bill here, uh, and we were just like stuck. And the only way out was to offload the assets and exit our investors into our solar power plants and say, sorry, like there's not, like it became an all or nothing play. The classic startup failure lesson.
But I think you'll pioneer this among the early entrants into the space. Great story. What advice would you give others thinking of launching startups in the space? What are the top three things you'd like to share with them? So,
Well, I think, what made this company particularly challenging, and it's something you have to think about when you build a company, is what is the asset? And here you had essentially a fixed asset. So there was something real involved, not virtual, but real. And so that limits your ability, right? You can't just move a solar power plant. And it falls within existing regulatory environments. So I think, unless you are an extremely aggressive business that truly believes it can scale fast, and here I'm thinking of an Uber or an Airbnb who maybe played outside of the regulatory environment because they knew they were going to grow fast and the investors were willing to take that gamble. You have to understand the regulatory environment you're dealing with. And just because you can start by ignoring that doesn't mean that that's the best course of action over the short to medium term. Maybe enough to get you out the gates, but the sooner you accept that, hey, I'm constrained by this, the better. The second I would say is, really, and I mean, I think this is pretty common knowledge, the VC you choose has to be willing to go along for the ride. They have to see the risks and be willing to fund you through those risks. And if the VC in some way you haven't told them or they don't seem to understand, that can become a real constraint. Because if your lead investor is not willing to go back in, it's hard to get follow on rounds unless you're just blowing everything out of the water. I would say that those two, and then the third would be don't innovate every aspect of the business at the same time. Sun Exchange tried to innovate in multiple ways at once, which meant that the challenges from an operational point of view were very high and large. Pick one innovation, focus on that, double down on that. Yes, maybe you can see down your growth path that there's another innovation you can bring in that might open up another market segment or opportunity, but don't try to swallow the whole apple at once. Take a bite.
no, you said something very powerful, Saul, because if I look at every great company, they went through a period where it may have seemed hopeless, and it's just not going to work, right? I read about the Netflix story, Tesla multiple times, Uber and Airbnb too, because they just Uber disrupted the taxi monopoly, right? And they just said ignore it. They were being threatened to be shut down, etc. So on the entrepreneurs and the team and the investors had that belief. I in your case, many of your VCs were they from Silicon Valley or US, or were they from South Africa? Because I think there can be a huge cultural differences, right, in their mentality and their risk
Yeah.
appetite and belief.
Our lead investor was that came in our Series A was an African-based VC.
VC.
And I think that in one of their funds, they had some DFI type money behind them. I definitely think their appetite for innovation was not the same as what, we would have had. We did have very early kind of angel type VC invest in out of Silicon Valley, and they loved it, but they weren't the kinds of investors that were going to come in again with bigger rounds. They were just very, that was their play, small, take a little bit, So, I mean, Sun Exchange was also, we also were raising our Series A into the middle of COVID. So that didn't help our efforts. So yeah, I think, if you can get that trifecta, right? The team, the founders, and the investors all see that vision, then you have a far greater chance of getting more money to help you through those.
No, well said, well said. So I'll end with this: your personal journey now. You had a good run, both as CFO and CEO. Created something transformational, made an impact on 100 plus. Were all your 100 odd projects in South Africa itself? All of them?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. So that's, obviously they will hopefully enjoy that for many years to come, the reduced power and all of that, right? What are your future plans? I think you'll make a great consultant for the industry with all the experience you have. And are you still, a two-part question, right? How optimistic are you about the future of this space, right? Despite the reality, despite regulatory challenges and all of that, are you, overall optimistic, or, a lot more pessimistic? And then the other part of the question is, what are your personal plans? And do you see yourself as a consultant to a bunch of other companies?
Yeah, I no, I'm optimistic. I'm a trained political economist. That's, my background. There's a market opportunity. The macro environment supports it. Energy demand is only going up. The AI boom, is only further reinforcement of that. Africa in particular, I'm very optimistic on. It's the youngest continent on the planet. There is huge amounts of innovation going on all over Africa. There's incredible entrepreneurs doing incredible things, and these are real problems. And I think as we deal with more and more of our virtual world and this and that, I think real stuff solving real problems that have real impact is real. And I think that humans want that, and they want to feel that their money's doing something real. It's not just speculation. I think so. I'm very optimistic about it. How the timelines, those are up for debate. I don't see the regulatory environment as a hindrance necessarily. I think if you don't pay attention to it, if you don't understand what you're dealing with, you can get yourself into a dead end. And I think that's the danger for many businesses in the world that try to innovate without paying attention to that. And I think regulations have their place. Personally, yeah, I mean, I'm, in a kind of an in-between space. I've definitely, worked hard over the last, 8, 9 years, and any entrepreneur will tell you that takes its toll. So I've had a little bit of a sabbatical for the while, but no, I definitely would like to find a way to provide, my knowledge back into young organizations, consult. I would love to see myself working with different VCs and other investors looking for opportunities in the marketplace and helping them and the businesses guide. One of the things I've learned over the 20 odd years of working in Silicon Valley and in South Africa is often you have a lack of real world experience sitting on boards or in investment committees, not, and I think that that's something unique that I offer. I continue to operate between the US and South Africa. I'm a dual citizen. I'm lucky to have that privilege. So I move between the spaces. And so yeah, I hope that I can kind of take all of this experience and knowledge and help other people realize success and impact.
Well, thank you again for your time. I greatly enjoyed this conversation. I learned a lot as well. If the opportunity comes in the future, would love to do this in front of a live audience and do a moderated discussion and cover some of these things and more. Appreciate everything that you shared, and I think the fact that you're optimistic, right, despite the challenges, the fact that you're optimistic, I think is great reassurance. Yeah, I think at the end of the day, right, I think what you all did was it create true value, right? It's one thing where you launch a shoe brand that people enjoy, right? Yes, there is value there, but this is actually delivering power to retirement homes, to schools or whatnot, right? What better utility than that? So kudos to everybody on the team for over the years, and I hope the private equity firm takes the organization the right direction so the impact continues. Yeah, well, I'd love to be in touch. Next time you're in the Bay Area, hit me up, and would love to get together, grab a bite.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I agree with you 100%. For the next 20 or 30 years, there are 100 plus solar power plants that will continue to produce power. Unfortunately, people didn't make the kind of returns they were expecting, but they had the impact that they were looking for. That makes me rest easy, versus shoe company that went under.
My best wishes to you and your family, and yeah, we'll be in touch on LinkedIn, and I would
Absolutely.
love to meet you in person when the opportunity presents itself.
I will look you up next time in the Bay and let me know if there's an opportunity to participate in something. I'd be glad to.
Sure, I keep my eyes and ears open. If I sense anything, I will message you.
Great.
Right
Yeah,
away.
like I say, I come over to the